afternoon and welcome to our panel discussion today. The topic is television news at the Crossroads. I'm Joann Lee, the moderator, and I'm also chair of the communication department here. First, I'd like to start off with a video that discusses technology and developments, and it was produced by the Museum of Media History.
It is the best of times. It is the worst of times. In 1989, Tim Berners-Lee, a computer scientist at the CERN Particle Physics Laboratory in Switzerland, invents the World Wide Web. Amazon.com is founded in 1994. Its young creator dreams of a store that sells everything. Amazon's model, which will come to set the standard for internet sales, is built on automated, personalized recommendations, a store that can make suggestions. In 1998, two Stanford programmers unleash Google. Their algorithm echoes the logic of Amazon. It treats links as recommendations, and from that foundation powers the world's fastest and most effective search engine. In 1999, a dot-com startup named Pyra Labs unveils Blogger, a personal publishing tool. Friendster arrives on the scene in 2002, and hundreds of thousands of young people rush to populate it with an incredibly detailed catalog of their lives, their interests, and their social networks. Also in 2002, Google launches Google News, a portal featuring headlines and links to the stories of the minute. Journalism organizations cry foul. Google News is edited entirely by computers. In 2003, Google buys Blogger. 2004 would be remembered as the year that everything began. Reason magazine sends subscribers an issue with a satellite photo of their houses on the cover and information custom-tailored to each subscriber inside. Google unveils Gmail with a gigabyte of free space for every user. Microsoft launches NewsBot, a social news filter. Google buys Picasa, a tool for organizing images.
Okay, the video raises a number of very important issues confronting information industries, in particular broadcast news. And so with us today, we have a very distinguished panel to talk about this. I'd like to start by introducing them. Mr. Eric Ober, he's had 40 years of media experience from 60 Minutes to the Internet. He's the founder, Crosstown TV, a high-end boutique television and broadband production and consulting company involved in various types of programming and live events. Mr. Ober also spent 30 years at CBS as an award-winning journalist and executive, holding such positions as president of CBS News, where he was directly responsible for 60 Minutes, 48 Hours, CBS Reports, the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Mr. David Puente, he's a broadcast producer and anchors a weekly news program for ABC News Now. In November of 2004, Mr. Puente created Exclusiva, a news program in English for ABC News Now, which reports the headlines from Latin America and the Hispanic world. The program is also aired as a podcast in English and translated into Spanish. Mr. Puente has won 2 Emmy Awards, one for his work on ABC 2000 and the other for his coverage of 9/11. Ms. Virginia Rohan has been television writer at The Record in Hackensack for the past 14 years. She joined The Record as a feature writer in 1986. She's won several New Jersey Press Association awards for critical writing, including a first-place finish in 1993. And Ms. Mary Alice Williams, she's one of the most well-established names in network news today. Ms. Williams brings to her current roles at WCBS 88 and the Discovery Health Channel an impressive history in broadcast journalism. Founding anchor and vice president of CNN, anchor and correspondent at NBC, writer and host of decades worth of programming on PBS and across the cable spectrum. She's won virtually every award in broadcast journalism, including a National Emmy Award for anchoring an evening newscast and The Matrix. Brian Ross, the chief investigative correspondent for ABC, is stuck in Washington, D.C. today doing a story. so he was unable to join us. He sends his regrets. So on behalf of the Communication Department here at William Paterson, I'd like to welcome our panelists and thank you for attending today. As we saw in the video, the limitations of traditional media distribution are breaking down. This has dramatic implications for broadcast news as we know it and as we've been practicing it. Technology has always been a driving force in shaping news and information delivery. From the printing press, we got newspapers, and from satellites, we can go live around the world. And now, the internet. It's posing an entirely different set of challenges. In 2006, the buzz is on such ideas as content creators, internet media retrieval, video-capable mobile phones, and platforms that allow for user-generated content aimed at the formation of video communities. So for today's presentation, I asked each panelist to begin with a 2-minute look at the future of television news, given the technological explosion in such areas as hardware, iPods, for instance, search engines, such as Google and that phenomenon, and websites such as Blogger or MySpace.com. So let's start with Mary Alice Williams. How have these technologies changed the way news has been delivered over the past 10 years or even prior to that?
I'm going to give you a really long history. Technology always works best in the hands of ordinary users. We have survived the advent of color tubes.
I was there for that.
And the mini-cam that allowed you to take a camera live out of the studio. And the advent of satellites, that first AT&T long lines and then satellites that allowed us to broadcast from all over the world. Each of those technological shifts were controlled by the insiders. This is the first one that's controlled by the users. This is the devolution that Thomas Jefferson would have loved. It really is power to the people. It is the most exciting of all the tectonic shifts that have happened in the communication industry, I think, because it's the one that has changed the very business model. Through each of the earlier iterations of new technology, the industrial age business model held. In television, it was advertiser supported. With cable, we got two revenue streams, advertisers and the homes, the subscribers, who were watching cable. This time, there is no such thing as those revenue streams. Everything on the web is free. Most of what you see on the web is totally free. The Huffington Post, Arianna Huffington has gotten a lot of attention for this vastly liberal blog, the Huffington Post. All the writers are paid not a penny. Arianna Huffington makes not a penny from it. It is power, it is influence, but it's not remunerative. The advertisers are now saying, wait a minute, if you can't guarantee us 10 million or 40 million sets of eyeballs per episode of whatever it is you're doing, we don't know which horse to place our bets on. So ad rates are falling. The business model is changing, and I don't think anybody, the experts, any expert worth his or her salt, is able to tell you today what it's going to end up being. I'm certainly not prepared to do that, but it's an exciting time, and I can tell you that if you don't take no for an answer ever, if you try a lot of things and hope the hits pay for the misses, you will figure it out in this new world.
Thank you. Okay, so Eric, I'd like to ask you about the idea of picking up on what Mary Alice was talking about, the financial...
You mean something about ancient history?
No, money, actually, the financial future of broadcast news as you see it, given what she's talked about.
Look, most of you here are relatively young students thinking about your futures, and many of you are probably worried that why would the world suddenly change at the moment in time you've got to worry about your careers. And I was quite depressed watching that video at the beginning of this show But I don't know whether I was depressed because of what the guy said or just the voice with which he used.
Yes.
The voice of, it's all over now, and if you're over 25, you're dead. Quite frankly, I don't actually have a negative view of your future or mine, because I think and Mary Alice used the term just moments before the show, which is fractionalization. It's just a pie being chopped up further. When print existed solely as the news medium, it had 100% of the market. TV came along and people said, oh, television news is going to put newspapers out of business. It's put a lot of them out of business, but it hasn't put all of them out of business. And the same thing went for when cable came along with 24/7 news, which meant you didn't have to watch an evening news anymore. You could have news all day. And you had radio with 24/7 news. And the reality is there are still 25 million people a night watching the 3 evening newscasts. The number 3 newscast, which is the one fronted by Bob Schieffer, and there's some new woman coming aboard that I may be the first to tell you about. But Katie's going to start in September. I think it's terrific. She's a terrific broadcaster. More importantly, she's a terrific interviewer and journalist and writer, and she has all the prerequisite skills. And I think the whole issue of the fact that she's female being some revolutionary issue, I think is quite unfortunate, because she's a terrific broadcaster. She'll do well. It doesn't matter what she is. But the issue with these evening newses is they still get 25 million viewers a night. So how can Bill O'Reilly, with 2 million viewers in 1 hour, be getting only a third of the audience of Bob Schieffer in a half hour with the number 3 evening newscast? It's actually fascinating to me that's a story that's passed everybody by. So I think the demise of the evening newscasts as being dinosaurs, look, it's an issue. You have people, particularly your age, getting your news from anything but evening newscasts. One of the reasons CBS is paying Katie all that money is because she will appeal to younger viewers than they have traditionally appealed to. She will also appeal to women viewers, more so than Dan Rather and Bob Schieffer did. So there is method to their financial madness in paying all this money. It's, you know what? You get what you pay for. When you pay Derek Jeter $16 million a year, or correct me, whatever he makes, or you pay Bon Jovi millions of dollars to make a concert appearance, or you pay Katie Couric to be the evening news host or anchor, it's the same issue. You get what you pay for. If advertisers who are looking at the numbers, as Mary Alice pointed out, they're looking at bulk numbers. If you bring in bulk numbers, advertisers will pay for it. And the fact is, because CBS knows, as does ABC, as does NBC, CNN, and all of the big broadcasters, that there's still a lot of gold in those hills in terms of bulk viewing. It's well worth it to pay Katie whatever it'll take. That doesn't mean people like you and others aren't getting their news from the internet, from podcasts, from blogs, from radio. Look, ultimately, I think the issue is fractionalization. And I think the other issue that should give you very pleasant pause is it's still about content. And as you make your choices about what news you listen to and trust, remember, a blog is not journalism unless it's done by a journalist. Anybody can do a blog. My mother, bless her, is 93 years old, lives in Queens. She has a lot of opinions. And if somebody could show her how to do it, she'd do Sarah's blog. And you know what? She'd have terrific opinions, but I wouldn't rely on her for the day's news. So you just need to keep content in perspective, understand your sources, and remember that blogs are unedited opinion from smart people, from stupid people, from crazy people. As long as you understand the source, so I wouldn't worry about your careers. I think your career is going to be fine in television news.
Thank you, Eric. We'll come back to the Katie phenomenon in a little bit. But first, I'd like to ask David, since you currently you're working with the podcast, can you talk a little bit about that in relation to broadcast journalism? Is it the same thing? Is it just a different platform? Are there different things going on when we're going in that direction?
Well, thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with some people that I respect tremendously and have followed their careers.
He's lying.
It's true. It's true. It's true. And
Did you meet me?
I met everyone at this table, but especially Mr. Ober and Miss Williams. It's actually a very exciting time to come into journalism. We can speak about the future, but the present, right now, in a sense, what is going on at ABC News Now is the future. It is a 24-hour news service that you get streaming video on the internet, so people are watching essentially what you would watch on television, but on your internet screen or on wireless devices such as Blackberries or cell phones. So it's very much happening right now at the network. Talk about fractionalization, still what the main broadcast, 2020, World News Tonight, Nightline, Good Morning America, the Weekend Show with George, still drive the network. But all of that content is also used at ABC News Now, plus original programming, which is what I've been able to do. So really, it's a time of risk at the network where they're allowing producers and correspondents to do things for the internet that they wouldn't be allowed to do, that we wouldn't have time to do on 2020, on World News Tonight. It's a more diverse programming that you see. Exclusiva, a program about Hispanic news and headlines, is not something that you're going to get on World News Tonight. You'll get a story about immigration, but you won't hear about the elections in Peru or Daddy Yankee. How many of you know Daddy Yankee? All right, good. Some people here do. Patti LaBelle and Emilio Stefan on the Celia Cruz exhibit at the Smithsonian. So it's very diverse. And that's very exciting. Let me see. How many of you actually have a BlackBerry? If you could just put your hands up. How many? Keep your hand up, please. How many have a cell phone? iPod. Keep your hands up. Cell phones, everyone keep cell phone, iPods, BlackBerry. How many of you also have, and keep your hands up, a home phone? Okay, so all of you have essentially a home phone, which is kind of like our traditional television in the living room, and in addition to that, you've got other devices. I see television really like that home phone that we've had forever, and the internet and the iPods as those cell phones that now everyone, just about everyone has a cell phone, but still has that home telephone. So I think it's a time of expansion. I think that for years when I started at the network already, there was talk about the demise not only of World News and the evening broadcast, but also of Nightline and also of the news magazine shows. And everyone thought, what's going on? From the young people who were very nervous about it to those veterans who had been there 25, 30 years. The future looked bleak. People are happier now. I mean, there's hope. There's expansion. There's the expectation of revenue through all of these devices. Otherwise, ABC News Now would not exist. So I think it's a very exciting time to come into journalism. I think that's essentially my message. It's a good time, and I'm here to prove it. And I'll be happy to talk to you more about News Now and about the other programs. But it's a good time.
Thank you, David. Virginia, you're a television writer for The Record. Right. You've heard three people talk about a range of the future. Right. How do you see it as someone who writes on the industry?
Okay, I know you don't want to get into Katie Couric just yet, but I have to say it was not only an amazing news peg for this day's event, but also I was quite intrigued by some of the stories that I was reading suggesting that the big issue would be, in terms of whether Katie would succeed, was whether she had the gravitas to be an evening news anchor. And I thought that argument, she will have a lot of challenges just because it is the third-ranked newscast, and that it is, even though, as Eric pointed out, the three networks together get 25 million, but they are an aging population. In fact, they judge that the evening news, whereas the rest of television is generally 18 to 49, it's 25 to 54, right, with Eric. Not with Eric, I'm saying. So anyway, that population is aging, but also because that whole voice of God kind of approach to the evening news that we had in the early days of television, it just wouldn't fly today. I mean, back, when Walter Cronkite first started, news anchors were kind of like the keepers of the information. The average person did not have access to, the wires were coming into newspapers and to networks, and so we kind of had to tune there. Well, now, I mean, all we have to do is type a few words into Google, and we have more information than we could ever imagine having. But I think, as my colleagues have said, that the big thing that television news in its many forms, whether it's through podcasts, is credibility, because so much of what you find when you type into Google is information that you really don't know where it's coming from. You don't know whether the writer has an agenda. You don't know whether the writer is affiliated with political parties, and so or whatever. So that credibility will always keep television news in the business. And that said, I think television news has to work hard to maintain that credibility with viewers. I mean, I would like to say, I don't see, I mean, the whole argument about news versus entertainment, I mean, that line's been blurring for a long, probably 20 years progressively. But if I am going to be watching a piece about a book that's in the news or about a movie that's in the news, I want to at the very least know if the network showing me that piece has a corporate connection to that project, because I mean, with media consolidation, I mean, we have these huge corporate families. So I mean, I think that's one way that network news can, in its many forms, can hold on to its credibility, is to be upfront with people. And just one other point that struck me about Katie having a non-traditional news personality was just what happened during Hurricane Katrina. I do think that television news will always be the place to turn during breaking news. I mean, we in the newsroom, we get wires and everything, but if something breaks, the news, first of all, televisions are on all the time, but everybody's gathering around the many TV sets to watch, because that is something that other people will not be able to compete. You read a blog, it doesn't have the same impact as watching live television. And during Hurricane Katrina, I mean, I was so struck by the impassioned reporting that came out of there. You take Anderson Cooper. I mean, I will never forget seeing him talk about, bodies lying on the street in one Mississippi town and rats gnawing on them. I mean, that kind of image, some people said it was inappropriate, but I thought back, that really, if you watch Edward R. Murrow documentaries like See It, like Harvest of Shame, I mean, that was advocacy journalism. So I think that is another edge that television news can have. I don't think it's inappropriate necessarily to be impassioned. I think that could be played up.
Okay, thank you, Virginia. I think everybody wants to go at this Katie Couric issue, so let's just go there. I'd like to start with the word credibility, and Mary Alice, the idea that for the first time, we'll have a solo woman anchor in a major evening news.
What took them so long?
Amen.
That line of having a woman in that position, it has been a broken trail. The first woman to anchor a network evening newscast was Marlene Sanders in 1964. The New York Times wrote about it on ABC, which the New York Times called the American Broadcasting Company. That's how long ago that was. And she did it for one night. And then there were, I guess, Barbara Walters in 1976. Harry Reasoner, she was paired with Harry, and his resistance to her was so palpable and uncomfortable that it didn't work. Even though Barbara was and is a terrific interviewer and has real heft and is tough as nails, trust me. I adore her. And then Eric selected Connie to pair with Dan Rather, and I am a huge fan of Dan's. He is a very gracious and sweet and smart man and has been a friend to me for longer than I've been alive, and I'm very grateful to him. But the same thing happened. There was this resistance, this inability to understand that together we're better than we are alone, that having someone to play off of makes you more human. And so that didn't work. I think that whole co-anchor thing. I was a co-anchor with Bernie Shaw when we began CNN, and for its first decade, Bernie's a terrific person who understood that together we're better. We tried to change the idiom, the voice of God idiom, and then found out very quickly within the first 6 months, as we were broadcast around the world, that we were translating into Japanese and Nigerian and French, and we kept getting calls from people saying, no, we want to learn American English. So we found that we had to do the whole thing in English but speak very slowly so that people could understand. Which is why I sort of got the reputation as an ice princess. Really, we were just speaking slowly so that people could understand, and that was what we were asked to do. Okay, whatever. Anyway, back to the woman thing. It is preposterous, as anyone can tell you, that women have less heft or gravitas than men. It is preposterous to suggest that they are less than because they actually know what it costs to inoculate an infant against measles, mumps, and rubella, and what a carton of milk costs. There is a voice and a sensibility a woman brings to any communication that is substantially different, not better, different than a man's. We need both of us. Katie is mother and father and breadwinner to her daughters and knows, I dare say, how much a carton of milk costs and what life is like on the ground, dealing with, as 25 million American women are, being single mothers to children and being the breadwinners. She is smart. She is gracious. She has the thick enough skin and the toughness to be able to take on all the hard knocks she's going to get, and we are all cheering.
Well, I guess you welcome the change.
No, I love Dan. I don't mean that. I love Dan. And, we're talking about Voices of God, and I'm just going to digress for a minute. Forgive me. Schieffer, that darling Bob Schieffer, comes in, and everyone else had a voice of God, even though they were a little more personable. Peter Jennings and Brokaw were more personable than the guys who went before them, less I come from nowhere, and more sort of connected to the audience, but still voice of God. And then Schieffer came in and said, when there's a fire across the street, you don't run to your friends and say, a 4-alarm fire whipped by 48-mile-an-hour winds raged through the house at 123 Glenwood Road today. You say, there's a fire across the street. And he went on the air on the CBS Evening News and night after night said, there's a fire across the street. This is the most incredible thing I've ever seen. Did you see that? That plane crashed, split in half, burned, and every single person walked out. This has got to be the most incredible thing I've ever seen. He started changing it. And this next iteration of anchors is going to change it even further.
Okay, I'd like to ask, thank you. I want to ask Eric something about the idea of gravitas. And it's more than gravitas, because certainly all of us grew up with the idea that the mantle, the anchor mantle from even before Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite, was kind of the voice of God. But they were seasoned journalists, hard news seasoned journalists, not personalities that come from television, like the Today Show. Everybody here at this panel, and myself included, embraces the idea of Katie moving into the slot. But there really are issues here journalistically, because the audience for the evening news, I think, traditionally is a much harder news audience. They're not there in the morning drinking coffee wanting someone to hold their hands, which is kind of Katie's brand of interviewing style and comfort level. What does this do to the nature of news as we know it for the evening news? Eric.
I think there are a few issues at play here. I think Mary Alice is absolutely right that the definition of what is an anchor person has changed over the years. And yes, it indeed was Walter Cronkite, magnificently, along with Huntley and Brinkley, and doing the voice of God anchor. But it's changed for a few reasons. It's changed because the culture has changed. It's changed because the definition of news has changed. Because I started out in local television when, unbelievably, the only definition of a lead story was a murder or a fire. And I remember one day producing a 6 o'clock newscast, and the most interesting and by far most important story of the day was the recall of a home appliance. I think it was a hairdryer, where apparently this particular brand of hairdryer, for spontaneous reasons, could kill you if, when you plugged it in, it felt like it, because they had made all these bad hairdryers. And it was a major company. And I remember saying to the news director, who presided in a voice of God way over the morning meeting, and there was all guys in the room. There were no women in the room. So a hairdryer, no guy would admit he used a hairdryer. And here I've got wire copy that says hairdryers that kill. And I said to the news director, this is actually, there are no terrific fires or murders today. Why don't we lead with the consumer story? And he looked at me as if I was out of my mind and said, you want to lead with a consumer?
How long ago
His
was
initials
this?
are EJ.
How long ago, Eric, was this mentality?
This is 70s, early 70s.
35
And he
years
said,
ago.
you want to lead with a consumer story. What's up a hair? And I said, yeah, this is more people are going to care about this story and be affected by it than another 2-bit fire in Queens. And look, that's gradually a change. People like John Stossel came along, originally at Channel 2 in New York as a consumer reporter, now a star at ABC. But suddenly John did very important stories, but amazingly they were consumer related. There were health related stories, medical stories, and the definition of news changed. And I think what's changed along with it, as Mary Alice described what Katie Couric is like as a human being, along with Connie Chung and Barbara Walters, and all of the women that have gone before her, as well as the men, Katie's just a regular person, and that's her appeal in the morning. And I don't, look, Brokaw obviously made the switch from morning to evening. There is a different event going on. The evening newses tend to be, quote, newses of record. They're news summaries. If you really want all the news of the day, you're better off reading the newspaper, quite frankly, because you'll get more news.
Yeah, except that's the news of yesterday.
Yes.
Well, yeah, okay, that's fair. But the issue, I think, is the definition of the evening news is more of a news of record than the long morning show. The personalities needed for a long morning show are different from somebody reading essentially a teleprompter and leading to videotape or live coverage. But the answer is there's nothing in her DNA or her experience that would indicate she can't do that, any more than Connie Chung, any more than Barbara Walters. These are all people who are very smart. They're terrific interviewers. What you see with Katie in the morning is essentially what is required of a morning personality.
But she
They don't
also
even
has
read the
range.
news in the morning.
I mean, she also
Absolutely.
interviews the president.
She's a killer interviewer
Yeah.
when she's on a story. And I think the fears that somehow she's too, quote, soft to do anything, they're ridiculous. I only saw one person take off after her, and it sadly was Andy Rooney, who at the age of 87, as you know, is the world's biggest curmudgeon. And Andy basically implied that this is a bad time for CBS because we're a hard news shop. I defy anybody in this room to tell me
Andy
the
doesn't
last
do
time
hard
they
news.
saw Andy do hard news. So, I mean, all of a sudden, Andy's wrapped himself in a flag of journalism, and he doesn't think Katie is the right person. And he does things on, what is this cap of a bottle about? This is what the man makes his living on.
You know that Mr. Cronkite, who I still call Mr. Cronkite, yesterday said, but women's voices will never carry any authority. I was told that, I started when I was 16, I was really young, and I was told that I had to go on the air now because by the time I was 25, I'd be off the air because nobody wanted to look at a girl over the age of 25, and women's voices would never carry authority.
I thought that was an amazing statement. I must say in his defense, because he's 89 or whatever he is, I think he genuinely has a hearing difficulty, which actually he does. And so I think any voice that isn't like a voice, that isn't like his voice, he has trouble hearing. But I thought it was a peculiar comment to make at that moment in time. Clearly he was asked by a reporter to comment on Katie Couric, and somehow he drifted off into the difficulty of hearing being able to listen to a woman's voice. I don't think he really meant that, but he drifted off into his hearing difficulty.
I wonder what the comments would have been if it had been Matt Lauer instead of Katie Couric getting an anchor chair. And we have to remember there's already, for now, a solo anchor woman, Elizabeth Vargas at ABC News.
But she's not really soloing because she's paired with Charlie or Diane.
But not always, no. She's been doing a lot on her own, in fact.
She's billed as a double.
She's billed
Bob
as a
Woodward
double.
and Vargas.
But she's been the face of ABC News Nightcast, solo many times of the week. I mean, more so now, I think, than a couple of weeks ago. It is a situation that's in flux. She was paired up with Charlie Gibson, often is. Diane Sawyer sat in with her as well. I think lately we've been seeing more of Elizabeth at the anchor chair solo. And as she said yesterday, it's good to see another woman anchoring the evening news. But I wonder what, and I don't know, I'm curious what you think. If it had been a Matt Lauer, if it had been one of the morning guys, would we have heard the same debate?
I don't think you'd have seen a thing. I do recall that when Brokaw, a wonderful anchor and a wonderful human being, went from the Today Show to
There was some
Nightly,
of that.
there was a little bit of,
But
he
he
got
had-
the gravitas.
But he had been a White House correspondent. He had been a war correspondent. He'd been in Vietnam. So he had all that. I think Matt would have had a little more difficulty. Charlie, in a heartbeat.
Of course.
In fact, there are still people at large in the land who wish Charlie had been the one selected.
And going
I
back to the
wanna
Mary
ask you-
Alice's voice, just the voice
Yeah.
of God comment, again, definitions change, and the fact is that, as Mary Alice described Bob Schieffer, a straight talker, the formality of news is essentially gone too. Peculiarly, the only, quote, slightly voice of God formal anchor now, oddly enough, is the very young Brian Williams,
Right.
who does sit there and kind of does anchor guy. And John Roberts, a man that I hired and I thought would have been a wonderful evening news anchor, had things worked out differently. And John, bless him, also does that kind of anchor thing. But I think the days are gone where I think you want a person who's credible with a brain giving you the news.
Yeah.
Your definition of what that is your definition.
And
I want to ask you one thing, because we're all kind of like on this bandwagon about Katie. And I'm going to be a cynic now, because I remember when I started in the business, being a woman definitely was a count against me, and being Asian American was 3 counts against me.
And now,
And now,
they'd hire you in a heartbeat.
the point
It's
is,
a really smart news executive, I'll bet hard you.
well,
I'm not so sure about that.
the point is here, I'm going to be a cynic and say, how much time does she have to prove herself before she may go in the way of the rather Chung combo in place of something? I'd like to ask Virginia this as a television writer. How much time do you think she has? And then we can all chime in.
Well, I think just because they're paying her so much money, she will have a good, she'll have a fair amount of time. But again,
How long? A year, 2 years, 6 months?
I would say
3
a
years?
year. I would say a year, which is a lot for television these days. I mean, you look at in primetime entertainment programs, where they measure minute by minute. I mean, sometimes shows are gone after one episode. They don't even care, even if it's a serialized drama. And a certain amount of viewers have gotten invested, they'll pull it. But I do think, at least a year. I mean, I was surprised that, Leslie Moonves, CBS president and CEO, was implying that the change he was thinking of was going to be far more radical. Do you remember there was a New York Times Magazine story about a year ago, and he was saying he was looking at everything, including like naked news. I mean, I'm sure he was being somewhat facetious, but he implied it would be a radical overhaul. So this seemed not as radical as I even would have thought it was. But again, what Katie's going to try to do is bring in a different audience. I mean, we mentioned Brian Williams. Well, his newscast is the top-rated newscast in the evening now. So the people who are watching him, which again, I think I saw a statistic that 10% of all people over 55 watch the evening news. So among that crowd, I guess there's still that kind of pining for the voice of God approach. And Brian is the top-rated in the evening. But what Katie has to do is bring in a new viewer, and I think she will. I mean, I don't know. It's such an unknown terrain. I think she will have to, the way Brian and everybody pretty much blogging and connecting. I mean, Katie's strength is that she has this, people feel that they know her. She connects to them. So if she does take advantage of these more modern technologies, I mean, that could really bring new people in, I think. But I do think, and maybe you all could tell me what you think, the biggest obstacle to the evening news for people I know is the time slot, the 6:30 time slot. I mean, nobody I know is home at that time. And Mary Alice, you mentioned people are either driving kids somewhere. But, I mean, if your kids are older or if you don't have kids yet, I mean, you're still at work, really. Our whole workday has extended so much that that time slot is what makes the evening news so irrelevant, in my view.
Okay. We have a lot, this is a great conversation, but I think the audience has some questions too, so I kind of want to extend this discussion to all of us. I see a hand up there. Jay has his hand up. Can we bring the mic to him?
Thank you. It's been a very excellent discussion. I just had a comment, and then I have a question. I go back to the radio days, and I think the original voice of God people were Gabriel Heater and maybe John Cameron Swayze and those people. But how about Edward R. Murrow? Did he not originally do some TV anchor work, and was he not in that mode as well?
Yes, he absolutely was. He did original. He was. He came after John Cameron Swayze. John was the first with the Camel Caravan of News, 15 whopping minutes, and then Murrow came. But he came from the Today Show template. He came from he turned Hear It Now on radio to See It Now on television, in which he would interview Hollywood celebrities in their homes, and then he took on Senator Joe McCarthy. So it was, but people gave him, we were all struck, I think, seeing Good Night and Good Luck. How many of you saw it? At how editorial Edward R. Murrow was during that television broadcast. We would write it much more elegantly than he did. And so I called a number of my friends who are in their 70s and remember this stuff, and they said, well, the United States granted him the right to do that because of his This Is London series from World War II, in which he was quite editorial. And some of what we saw during Katrina dates back to This Is London by Edward R. Murrow. Have I even come close to remembering what your question was?
Thank you. We have
Just one comment on that question too, which is this long tradition of, quote, objective journalists in the chair is somewhat bogus anyway, if you look at it historically. Edward R. Murrow, who clearly had strong opinions, and he did, I think it was a Friday night show, as a matter, with people in their homes. Mike Wallace did, with a cigarette, interviewed people and grilled them, and it was anything but objective. Walter Cronkite did a show almost kid-like for his. It was go back in history where they used actors.
Right.
Anybody remember the name of that show? But
No, but
again,
Recreations?
you are there. So I mean, this issue of the purity and sanctity of
Oh, please get over it.
get over it.
Okay, we had a hand here.
You talked about credibility. Some people have accused the network news of having a liberal bias. Is there any truth to that?
The network news, does anyone want to take that on?
You can go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead,
we're not
hang
afraid of the
yourself,
question.
Mary Ellen.
Absolutely.
The network news is not monolithic. Each network is made up of 1,500 people, all of whom come from different levels of education, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different religious persuasions, and different sensibilities. No good organization, print or broadcast, or podcast for that matter, has all of the editorial position in the brain of one person, except for Fox, and which is not journalism. And that it would be dangerous. So our editorial meetings in the mornings, at which people are standing up on chairs and screaming, and arguing their points of view is the way the sausage gets made. There is no particular ideological bent any more than it's fair to say that New York is a blue state and Missouri, where I came from last night, is a red state, although it's pretty red. So no, I mean, that's baloney. Was Dan Rather openly liberal? Yes. Was Tom Brokaw? No. In fact, he bordered on conservative.
As does Schieffer.
Right.
Schieffer's
quite
politics are-
conservative.
We used to call him the House Republican. But let me give you another version of the answer, which is, I think if you think about what the job of journalists and media is, it's to be a watchdog. Which means if everybody's mad at you, you're probably doing your job.
Right.
And if you're a watchdog, then the government in power, whether it's the local school board in Wayne, or whether it's the mayor in New York City, or whether it's the Bush administration, is not going to be happy with you because you're there to turn over rocks. And that is ultimately the mission. And if you're not doing that, then you're not doing your job. So I think the issue of liberal bias, my recollection when Clinton was in power, Clinton was mad because the media was piling on about Lewinsky. So then there was some, the bias is usually based on who's in and who's out, which means the media is doing its job.
I just wanted to add to that I think newspapers have been accused of, certain newspapers, of the same thing. And exactly what Mary Alice said, there is no way you could get any, first of all, journalists tend to be very independent thinking people, at least I think they should be. You could not convince your colleague, and you get a cross-section of views in a newsroom. Now, on the editorial page, there is a decision as to what the paper's editorial stance is. But among the average journalists, you could never get somebody on the same page, even if you wanted to. And also, I just think that what Eric said, I mean, our role is to be skeptical of, not take things at face value, and not, regardless of who's in power. You wouldn't want a press or a television news outlet that was just taking things and spilling it back, just regurgitating it the way some outlets, I guess, do.
If anything, I think you got to worry about the media kowtowing to the powers that be. And, I'll give you an example of one where I regret it, and I will always regret it. When Newt Gingrich was newly in power, I was at CBS News, and I think the media, including CBS News, was so busy working the new Republican group run by Newt Gingrich, that I think we not only never laid a glove on him, we never questioned things. In some ways, that happened with the Iraq War. I mean, the media is now being accused of not, rooting for it enough. But originally, I think the media jumped on board, didn't question why we were there.
Because they were afraid of being cast as traitors.
The media is constantly in danger of being used and misused. And I think the media is at its best when it is thinking independently and acting independently, and that usually annoys people.
And has the spinal cord to speak truth to power.
All right, we have a question back there, Ron.
I have a question about blogs. There was a comment earlier that a blog is not journalism unless a journalist does it. Why would a blog done by an intelligent observer of the world around not be as valid as one done by a journalist?
It's opinion.
And the journalist is not expressing opinion in a blog?
Here's what I was saying, that anybody can do a blog. And obviously the credibility and factual nature of the blog, or the opinion nature of the blog, is totally a function of the writer of the blog. And when I said that a blog is not journalism, what I meant it to be was that you should not rely on an individual with an opinion or an individual with expertise. Could be tying flies for fishing, or it could be an individual who's read a lot of history and, believes he or she is an expert on how, historical indications show why we act like we do now. It still doesn't make the person a journalist. A journalist is educated in journalism, and a journalist is experienced in journalism. It doesn't make the blogger invalid, but what it does do, and the only point I was trying to raise, and I'm sorry if you have a blog that I've annoyed you on, but the only point I was trying to raise is in terms of journalism, if you want to trust a blog, you need to know whether that blog is factually accurate. And too many people nowadays, there is now a rush. Look, it's always the flavor of the month. And this month's flavor is blogs. Last month's flavor was podcasts. And next month's flavor will be something else. You have all these community sites now that are being paid for because advertisers want young users on these community sites. But these community sites are purely, they're content created by individuals with no particular expertise, except on what they're doing, but that's not journalism. All I was saying is don't mistake a blog with an opinion. Even a blog from a college professor who is an expert in a field that isn't journalism. That may be a perfectly valid blog once you establish that the person knows what they're talking about. It's still not reporting the news in a journalistic sense. I was actually being simpler than I think you took it.
Okay, thank you. Gina, I think you had a question.
You've talked a lot about the presentation of the news, and I'm interested a little bit in asking a question about the content. I teach here, and I did a kind of a poll of my students, and most of them know all of the details about Brad and Angelina, but they don't know what Darfur is. And we got into a discussion of, whose responsibility is it? Is it the journalists and the media to give this information, or us as the consumers to seek it out? Because when they learned about it, they were horrified. So I wonder what your opinions of that are.
I mean, I think one of the important things that a broadcast like ABC News Now brings is that one of the things we've often heard on the nightly shows is that there isn't enough time to give you all of the important stories that are going on around the world. Well, now, if you have the time to seek out that news, it's there. I mean, we had a great report live from the Sahara Desert. Jonathan Carl was in Africa with a video phone, and he was on my show. So you can find out about what's going on in North Africa. You can find out about what's going on anywhere in the world, which is one of the things why I'm very excited about this new media, which is one of the reasons why I'm excited about doing the kind of work that I do. We're able to talk to you about stories in addition to the top news of the day that you're going to be hearing constantly on CNN and on Fox, and that you'll see on the broadcast in the evening. Podcasts and webcasts, because what World News Tonight also does actually at 3 o'clock live every day on ABC News Now is a webcast. So you'll see Elizabeth on at 3. It's kind of a summary of what World News Tonight is, and it's actually also getting you more in the newsroom and seeing how the stories are developing. Because if you see some of the stories on at 3 o'clock in our live webcast, you'll see what has changed during the day, or what has even changed as far as guests or an angle on the program. But we're able to talk about stories like Darfur, and I think that in large part at ABC, because of News Now, we have people like Brian Ross who could be working on a story for World News Tonight. It may be on Al-Qaeda, but there may be some interesting story that I want to tell about ETA in north of Spain. And I can have Brian, who's an expert and knows that terror group, on my show to tell everyone what they may not be hearing about on Good Morning America or on the nightly news.
In other words, it's a two-way street. You've got to go for it. I think one of the problems created by the new technology, particularly for young people who are not as accustomed as us old folks are, to distinguishing between television and broadcast and cable, is that it's all stuff on a screen. Stuff on a screen that comes to you from who knows where. And where was I going with that? You know about Brangelina because you saw it on one of those dreadful shows that comes on after the news, the 7 o'clock entertainment programs. You know about Brangelina because Brangelina comes up on a pop-up when you're Googling through looking for something. But you have to be responsible. We as citizens have to be responsible for finding out about this. I think all of us have done just a terrible job trying to cover Darfur. One of the reasons is that it's so bloody dangerous. And the United Nations pulled out last, Friday? Or was it this past Monday? But it's very difficult to get in there and cover it, but it also seems so arcane because there's no oil there, and it's not part of what is generally falls under the category of American interests.
That's the ultimate chicken and egg question, your question, which is, you suffer from it too at school, where you have students who don't seem motivated, and you sit there and go, have I failed them, or are they failing me? Should their parents have motivated them better so that they want to be in a learning environment? I think the issue of foreign news is critical. Foreign news got covered a lot more after 9/11, and most of us were very happy about that happened for the wrong reasons. But I think the issue of Darfur, which obviously should be covered more, and I laud the fact that ABC's doing it better, but here's the problem. When the networks spend a fortune to go cover it, what they find is viewers don't want to watch it. So that when 48 Hours, which is now reduced to a bunch of murders a week, 48 Hours actually used to do 48 Hours in places like Darfur. And a funny thing happened. They were the lowest rated shows they had. So that the public out there who goes, we want more important news, hypocritically didn't watch the damn shows. So CBS, being financially minded, said, why go to Darfur and spend $500,000 when we can go to Miami, cover cheap murder, and spend $100,000 and get more viewers? So I think it works both ways. I think there is something seriously culturally wrong in this country when people don't care about Darfur, because Europeans do in far greater numbers than we do. And I think that gets to the parenting in this country, the education system in this country, and the media in this country. We're all culpable. But so is the home.
I just wanted to add one thing to that. I agree with everything you say, but I think part of the problem is that when television news stopped being a loss leader, when it became a profit center, so that it really matters. So if 48 Hours is doing something very important, somebody will be watching it, that maybe at one time people could take the hit on that. But you can't take the hit on that. So that's where it becomes more important for viewers to demand better. There's this whole argument that, remember the old argument, do we give them what they want or give them what they need? And if you ask people it's much easier to watch a story on Brangelina. And, I was thinking last night as I was watching, one of the 1000th story on Natalie Holloway on cable news, which, it's like, this is a very, it is compelling to watch some of these murder stories, but is it really news? Is it news that should be taking so much of our time?
It's eye candy. I hate to say it. It is mental eye candy.
Yes.
It's easy. It's easy for journalists to cover. It's cheap. Doesn't cost that much. No one's going to sue you.
Right.
If you do a story on tobacco industry, on the medical industry, they're going to sue you. You do a crime story like that, keep it running, you're going to get the eyeballs.
That's right.
But intrinsically, where's the substance? It's just basically
really
a version of eye candy.
Ultimately, you go, well, the American public needs to be better served, and yet the American public essentially owns these public media companies. And if you think their stockholders, who are all of us as well, don't want money, higher stock prices, and dividends, if Viacom or CBS now or Disney or GE went back to its stockholders and said, we want to make news a loss leader the way it used to be, the way when Mr. Paley ran CBS and said, I'll make my money in entertainment, I'll lose my money in news. That's what we want to go back to. That management would be thrown out by the stockholders. So the problem is endemic, and it's more than just the media's failure to cover Darfur. The media has failed to cover it well, with some exceptions. But it goes at the whole sociology of this country.
Diane, I think Diane had a question, and then someone
as a way of kind of linking these two topics, I'm interested in as news changes in the ways that we've talked about, but as the appetite or the need for internationalism increases, I'm curious about the application of journalistic standards, going back to your discussion of that. As we internationalize, do journalistic standards change? The ability, for example, to take information from the countries of origin of those information and the need to do that. Are there issues that arise about journalistic standards or is journalism's role seen in a similar way throughout the world? The role of the journalist as opposed to...
Man, you've asked a lot of questions.
Right.
No, it is not seen in a similar way throughout the rest of the world. But on balance, in this country and in many of the more developed countries, it's considered, I don't think the standards change. I think you find a story, you check the story, you double-check the sources, you look for political agendas, you work in consort with a number of different brains from different backgrounds so that you're getting it right, you're hitting it close to the middle every time, and I don't think that changes.
Okay.
You know, one thing that I, from working in Europe for several years before coming back to the U.S., was how in Europe you do get a sense of newspapers, of television stations that have much more of a bias, a political bias, where in France you know that Le Figaro is more conservative. In Spain, you know that El País is more liberal. And so that's something that's very interesting, and something that maybe there's a sector of the public that really likes that, because Fox has certainly been a big hit, and so is talk radio. But that's very interesting.
Okay, Mary Alice has to go back to New York, so she may be just vacating her chair at some point, not because she doesn't think this discussion is important.
No, this is a fascinating discussion, and we could go on for hours. I'm sorry I have to leave.
Thank you for coming. Thank you so much. We have one more question, I believe, in the right here.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for coming. As a college student, it's kind of different from teachers here. You know, I actually have different questions. My first one is, I'm a freshman, but I am looking for grad school, and I'm wondering, what is your input in that? Do you think it's necessary to have a master's in journalism?
What do you, if life were perfect, what would you be doing at the age of 25?
I would be a reporter.
Okay.
I would say, if, you know, this is what's worked for me in my personal opinion. When I got back from reporting in Europe, I was based in Paris and Madrid and London for about 6 years as a freelancer for print and broadcast and radio, and basically taking all the strings that I could take. I got back to New York. I had worked with a lot of the executive producers, especially at ABC, so they knew my work, and I knew that was going to help me, I hoped, get a job. But I thought, you know, what if a job doesn't come along? And then I applied to Columbia. I was accepted, and then I got an offer for a job at ABC. So for me, what worked, and I have to tell you, at that point, my applying to graduate school, more than anything, was to make contacts again in the news business in New York, which I thought I needed if I wasn't going to be hired at ABC. So I was already working. I was already doing it. And I think that even at NYU undergraduate, where I did journalism, you know, we went out and wrote stories. The professors really just sent us out, and it was about getting the story written. In that case, I was doing print. It was divided. So it was really about just going out. It's a craft, and getting good at it, and keep doing it, and being aggressive after stories, and being creative with the pitches. So my personal opinion would be that if you can go out and get a job, that's a great grad school.
My other question is actually for you. As a Spanish-speaking female, do you think it's easier the Spanish newsroom to get in than, in fact, the English news stations?
You know, I don't know. I've never worked just on Spanish TV. I can tell you that I think at all the networks there is an attempt to diversify. It won't make it easier because you're a Latina to get into a network, though. If that were true, we wouldn't have such a problem with diversity, which we still, especially at upper management is a terrible, terrible problem within the networks. At ABC News, there is a diversity committee that's been appointed by the president, and it's not just about your race or your sex, but it's also about political diversity, and it's about regional diversity. So on this committee, there's really an attempt to diversify that newsroom because it's going to be a better product that we're putting out to the public. So David Weston really has that broad definition of what it is to diversify. However, we exist at ABC because it is a problem. But I don't know if it'll be any easier to get into a Spanish station. I think what is interesting is the future of bilingual news and bilingual stations. That's interesting.
You're a freshman, which means you have 4 years to do internships. I think the single most important thing beyond your critical academic performance here is the internships, because the internships over the next few years will give you exposure and experience in news operations. Whether you need graduate school when you graduate from here or not is actually going to be a function of whether during those internships you've made the right contacts and impressed the right people with your work ethic to get a job. I know people who've come right out of college to jobs, and I know people who've needed to go to graduate school. There's no set rule. It's all individual, and you'll figure it out. But the saddest thing to me is to talk to college juniors and seniors who are just then thinking about internships.
Yeah.
You need to think about an internship right now.
Yeah, that is key advice. Internship.
Okay, thank you. We have a question right here.
Yeah, I heard you a few times talk about viewers and the fact that for nightly news, most of the viewers are 55 and older. Now, I know as a college student and even as a young adult, I'm either at school or I'm at work for the most part. Most of the time, I end up getting my news from Jon Stewart and The Daily Show. And yes, it's comedic, and yes, it's maybe biased or whatever, but do you see a future in those type of news shows ever coming towards nightly news or even at an earlier time
There's a
rather
couple
than...
of reasons. They don't need to, and I'll tell you why. In the old days, before there was cable and 24/7 news access, arguably, I think one of the networks might have, Don Hewitt, the creator of 60 Minutes, his whole life has said there ought to be an 8 o'clock newscast. And whether it would have done well competing with two networks doing entertainment or not, I don't know the answer. But right now, economics will keep that from happening. And 7 to 8 is actually local time. It's not network time. More importantly, you know, when you come home, you have the option of watching news on on CNN, on Fox, and on MSNBC. So you're not underserved. I mean, you know, if I were at ABC or as I was at CBS, I would wish you would watch an evening newscast or a morning newscast. But the fact is, unfortunately, for CBS and ABC, not NBC, which has MSNBC, they did not get into the 24/7 cable business, although ABC has been very aggressive and I think very smart and successful in doing what they're doing that David's involved with. But the answer is you can get your news whether you party and come home at 11 o'clock at night. You look like a guy who parties, although you don't have a BlackBerry like she does. I want to know why you have a BlackBerry. But the answer is you can come home and watch cable news and get perfectly well served, whether it's CNN headline news or Paula Zahn or Anderson Cooper or Fox if you like Fox. But I just think the day has passed that you're going to see NBC, CBS, or ABC do an 8 o'clock primetime news. Just not going to happen.
But you know what is happening is what I described a little bit earlier, where you can get on the internet wherever you are. Soon you'll be able to do it on your phone more easily and watch Elizabeth Vargas doing the webcast, doing nightly news essentially at 3 o'clock. Or if you're not going to be home Friday for 2020 at 10 o'clock, but you really want to watch Shakira's interview, or you want to see Brian Ross's investigation of infections that are killing people in hospitals, you can go on ABC News Now and watch the unedited interview, or choose and pick and choose what you want to watch. And I think
up and running now?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And
You
there's always TiVo.
go to abcnews.com. And it's a subscription service, ABC News Now, but you get a trial membership as well. So you should check it out, ABC News Now. You should check it out.
We have time for one last question. We have a microphone down here. Please keep.
Yeah, so I have a question. Excuse me. One thing that we've been talking about is that we have many more choices than we had before, right? So you were talking about options at abcnews.com. I wanted to know what it means, how it changes your job, and certainly how it changes the culture that we have an illusion of complete choice, right? We think we can find anything on Google, or we can find anything through new sort of international news services that we can access online. So what does it mean that many people growing up with these services have the illusion that they can see the whole world through their browser?
I mean, it's changed my job because the show I created, which is Exclusiva, the headlines, Latin America, the Hispanic world, I'm able to work on things that I would not have been able to work on. I couldn't interview the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, even for Nightline. It might have been a Nightline interview. It might not have. I could do it. We do a phoner with Evo Morales in Bolivia, and we have it on live, and he talks to us about, how he expects his presidency to go. So it's just changed it editorially. And then what I can do, when Diane Sawyer is thinking of interviewing Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, I can go to her, because he's a interesting, polemic leader. I can go to her and say, Diane, from my show, from the things I've been doing, I know this great journalist who's got great stories about Hugo Chavez. We have to talk to him if we're going to do this interview for Prime Time or GMA or Good Morning America. So, in that way, it's diversified. I mean, it really has at ABC News. That's what that's allowed me to do, is to become more of an expert in an area and really fulfill what David Weston wants to do, which is then have that diversity really impact the programs and really make us smarter at ABC News.
But I guess my question is, does it create the sense that there are no limits when there are still limits on what we can do?
What do you mean by limits?
And what do you mean by illusion of access?
Okay. For instance, my family lives in Nigeria. It's still hard to get a lot of local news from Nigeria, but many of my students may not know that. We may not know that much of the information that we can find on search engines is still based in a handful of countries. All right, so that's sort of what I mean by the illusion that we are seeing the world when we're still only seeing a small part of it.
I mean, we don't have, even though it's something that actually I've thought about, because we do, it's a daily show about international headlines. Worldview, it's called, on ABC News Now. Thursdays is Worldview Exclusiva, which is a Latin American Hispanic show. But we have thought of doing an African continent, even though that's immense, program, or a day for the Asian headlines, or Southeast Asia, Australia. So we have thought of that, and I think that's coming. Certainly the platform is there. And, I can't, it's not Nigeria, but getting news from Chile is also tough. I mean, how many people know that Chile has the first female president ever? Good for you. And she's an interesting woman. Actually, Oprah. She was in the Oprah magazine. So this is allowing, it's not an illusion. I mean, I'm bringing those headlines, I'm bringing that news to people who are interested in it, and also through the podcast.
Okay, I want to first of all say that we're pretty much finished with our time here. Some of you have classes at 2, so I'd like to thank everybody involved for putting this together, in particular John Rhodes, who helped me coordinate this, and members of the IRT staff, especially Pat Ryan, who helped us with this terrific equipment and the show today, and also my staff in the office, especially Sandy Pilley, and of course Dean Garcia for her support in this, and last but not least, all the panelists. Thank you very much.